Today I'm going to be making a seafood chowder, and it's a cream-based chowder, and today is just kind of one of those cold winter days. It's snowing outside, and something like a warm soup just sounds really good. So I'm going to be using some clams, as well as some scallops and some cod. So to start out, I'm just putting 2 pounds of clams, these are just savory clams, in a large pot. And to that pot, I'm going to add some garlic juice. Now, how I get the garlic juice that I'm going to use today is just from a jar of minced garlic, where I'm going to just drain that garlic and use the juice and dump that juice, probably about 1/4 cup or so, over top of those clams. And then I'm also going to be adding a bottle of Chardonnay, and it's just a cheap bottle of Chardonnay, like $3.68, I think, so like $3 or $4. I don't use a super expensive wine when I'm cooking seafood. So this is, there's no water included. It's just the cleaned, you want to really clean your clams well, and then go ahead and add that garlic juice and then the wine. And we're going to bring that to a full rolling boil until all of those shells have opened up. So you don't want to use any clams whose shells don't open up after you cook it, and you also don't want to use any clams who their shells are opened before you actually start cooking them. So you want to make sure your clams are alive, in other words, and then cook them. But I kind of feel better about it because when I cook my clams, honestly, hopefully they don't feel it if they do have any nerves, because I just poured an entire bottle of wine over top of them. So they got really drunk, and then they got cooked. So after you boil those clams, we're going to just go ahead and strain them out of that broth. And we're going to let those clams actually sit and cool for a minute. And while they cool, we're going to cook the cod in that same broth. So we're going to take this nice white wine clam broth and return it to the stock pot. And then we are going to get our pound of cod. So we've got a pound, it's actually a little under a pound, but we're going to put that cod just right in the broth and cook it just for a couple minutes. You just want to cook it until it's done. You don't want it to be overcooked. You want fish to be nice and moist. So we're just going to turn this on medium heat, bring it to a boil, and let it cook for just a couple minutes till that fish is cooked. Meanwhile, we're going to take these clams out of the shells and discard those beautiful shells. I always love how beautiful the shells are on the inside. That purple color is just so pretty to me. So I'm just going to go ahead and chop these clams up. And you just want to chop them up into, like half or thirds or so. You don't want to like mince them, but it creates like more little pieces to go into the chowder if you chop them a little bit instead of just leaving them completely whole. So the same goes for the fish. Like, you just want those flavors to be in every bite and spread throughout the soup. So yeah, just chopping those up a little bit. And again, this is about 2 pounds of savory clams. These are not manila clams. The manila clams are usually a little more expensive. Some people prefer them. But we've just got our clams chopped, and we actually have our cod over here that's finishing. So the cod finished, and we did the same thing with draining the broth out and returning the broth to the pot. And then we're going to add our pound of scallops into that broth and just cook the scallops for a few minutes, and then drain the broth one more time. Meanwhile, I took about 1.5 pounds or so of small red potatoes and a bunch of green onions and chopped those up into just kind of nice small pieces. And I'm going to take a half a stick of butter and melt that down And then to that, I'm going to add those chopped green onions as well as a couple spoonfuls of minced garlic, and just let that go ahead and simmer. And then I'm going to add all of that seafood, so the scallops, the clams, chopped clams, and the cod, and then just kind of stir that around and just cook it lightly in that butter just for like a couple minutes, just to make sure those flavors blend really well. Meanwhile, you're going to boil your potatoes, and we want to cook those separately. So this is just water, so just go ahead and boil the potatoes in water until they are tender to a fork. Meanwhile, while those potatoes are boiling, you're going to take 4 cobs of corn and cut the corn off of the cob, or you could use frozen or canned corn, but I really love the fresh corn because when you cut it off the cob, it kind of makes corn milk as well. Just go ahead and take that corn and add it to the pot with the butter and the scallions and the so all the different seafood. So now we're going to use the other half of that stick of butter and just go ahead and drop it back in that skillet that you were using for the sauteing of the green onions. So we're going to just let that melt. And then once it's melted, we're going to go ahead and whisk in probably like a tablespoon and a half or so of flour. Not too much flour, but you do want to add a little bit of thickness to this. So just go ahead and whisk that flour into the melted butter. And then we're going to have a container of half and half ready. We're going to add about a cup or so of half and half into this, and then go ahead and whisk that until it's smooth again. So just keep kind of building this base with the butter, the flour, and the half and half. Keep on whisking that together until smooth, and then cook it a little bit. Just kind of bring it to a boil, and make sure that like it's thickening. So you don't want to add more half and half before it's thickened. So you'll know it's thickened when, as you're whisking, you'll start to kind of see the bottom of the pan for longer. So like as you stroke across with the whisk, it'll start to kind of like separate at the bottom of the pan, and that means it's kind of getting thick enough to the point where you need to add some more liquid to it. So this is what you want to see when it's thick enough. That's what I mean by you can kind of see the bottom of the pan a little bit. So go ahead and add another cup of the half and half, and just keep whisking, let it thicken a little bit again, and then you're going to add everything else. So you add in your cooked potatoes, the corn, the seafood, green onions, all that good stuff, and we are going to stir this together. And meanwhile, you've been kind of letting your broth, the wine broth, the white wine and clam and seafood broth kind of sit off to the side. And while that has cooled down, it's probably kind of settled a little bit. So we're going to be using that shortly as well. But before then, we're going to add some spices. So I'm adding some tarragon, probably about half a teaspoon or maybe a little bit more. Also, I'm adding in some parsley, and you know, this is dried parsley. You could obviously use fresh parsley if you wanted to. And I'm going to just juice half of a lemon into the pan as well. So I haven't added any salt and pepper yet. However, some of that seafood, especially the clams, you know, do come from salt water and have a little salt in them. So this is what the broth looks like. It looks kind of like a bad color, but it's actually delicious. So you're going to add a couple cups of that, and this is, you just kind of like dip the cup, the measuring cup or something into the bowl and just let it run in. So you're kind of avoiding the sediment because you don't want any of the graininess from the bottom of the bowl to get into your soup. So when you cook clams, there's a little bit of graininess just because they come from the ocean. Sometimes there's some little sediment, a few little rocks or things like that that end up in the bottom. You just want to make sure you don't get any of that. So if you just let it settle off to the side, all that will just go to the bottom, and you just scoop the broth off of the top to make sure that you're just using enough broth. So you keep just adding that broth and half until you feel like it's the right amount of broth to potatoes, corn, and seafood. And I like my soups to be really chunky and hearty and not just brothy, I guess. So I used most of the clam and wine broth, as you can see. And I'm gonna, I just used probably like 2.5 cups of half and half or something like that. And then I'm just going to reduce this a little bit, meaning I'm just gonna let it bubble on kind of a medium-low temperature until it is thick again and creamy and just, feels right. So it's a little bit thin right now. So I'm just going to kind of cook it down until the broth gets thickened up a little bit more. So it smells so good. And then I'm going to also be adding some black pepper, some salt, and a little bit of celery seed in a minute. So you just want to add black pepper or white pepper. I don't happen to have any white pepper on hand, but some kind of pepper, and then some salt just to season, and a little bit of celery seed as well. And then stir that all together and just do that to taste. I mean, you can taste it and see if you need to add any more salt or not, or any more pepper or whatever. You can even add a little bit of chili powder, a little bit of cayenne, or a dash of hot sauce if you want a little bit of spice to it. But this one I'm going to keep for today, just keep it nice and savory and creamy, and that's just like so delicious. It really helps to be able to taste that like little bit of tarragon. You can even put some thyme and some other seasonings in here if you want. This is looking pretty delicious to me, so I think it's about ready, and I am going to go ahead and serve up a bowl and enjoy my lunch. So you can really see all those nice chunks of cod and scallops and potatoes and fresh corn and clams and everything. So I'm ready to eat my seafood chowder, and it is just so thick, and it's got a lot of nice chunks of like the cod. I can see the clams in there, the scallops, and everything is kind of like a similar size of chunks, even the potatoes. So the pieces are kind of a similar size, which makes it really distribute the flavors well. So I'm gonna go ahead and try it. It's especially really good with the corn, that fresh corn. But I love that, like, you can taste a little bit of the tarragon, a little bit of the celery seed, but mostly just the creaminess of that broth and the half and half and the butter. So good. You know what would go really well with this is probably a nice batch of my yeast rolls, or maybe even some fry bread. But a really nice bread would really like just set this soup off. So now I have to go make bread. So try a seafood chowder. Previously, I posted my recipe for kind of a vegetable soup, and it was a really hearty vegetable soup. And I also have a yam stew recipe that's super good, and that's one of Franklin's favorites. But if you want something a little bit richer and creamier, then definitely try a chowder. If you don't want to do all three seafoods, like the scallops, the clams, and the cod, you could just do cod, or you could just do like whatever's on sale, whatever seafood's on sale. So mix it up. If you don't have those little small red potatoes, you can just chop up like some bigger red potatoes. Just make sure that you chop them up into little half bite-sized pieces. And then if you're not able to get the fresh corn to cut the corn off the cob, then go ahead and use some frozen corn, or if all else fails, use a can of corn. Just make sure to drain the juice out of the can of corn if you use canned corn. And if you have fresh parsley, you can use that instead of the dried parsley, or fresh tarragon. I prefer either chives or green onions to like white or yellow onions, just because I don't like the texture of those kinds of onions in a chowder. But yeah, just give it a whirl. Garlic, you can mince up your own fresh garlic. Again, I use some garlic juice in the beginning with that kind of like infuses into the broth to cook the clams in. And then also those two spoonfuls or so of garlic toward the end when I was sauteing the green onions. So I'm going to finish my bowl of chowder. And if you make it, definitely let me know what you think of this recipe.